So hi, my name is Bill Burnett. Thanks for the introduction, Corinne. And I'm going to take you through this discussion of design thinking and the art of critique, and this process we call I like, I wish. I love this quote from Mark Twain. I love lots of quotes from Mark Twain. One of my favorites is, if I'd had more time, I would have written you a shorter letter. I think if I'd had more time, I would have made this a shorter presentation and more concise. But this one is really about the idea, I think it's fundamental to design thinking, is that we start the process of trying to innovate by assuming we really don't know what the problem is. And I always say we like to start with people, not the problem. But as Twain said it, it's not what we don't know that hurts us. It's what we know for sure that just ain't so. So let's talk about design thinking first to make sure everybody's got the background. We always show this process diagram. Design thinking is a process. We start, as I said, with people, not problems. We start with empathy and empathizing with the situation at hand. Whether we've been given the challenge to reinvent civic engagement. We just had an election yesterday, and some of my students are working on trying to get people to participate more in the civic processes, like voting and being part of your, the government of your local town or wherever. And we take that problem and then we say, that's probably the wrong way to look at it. And we go out and we talk to people. So my students were out all yesterday at the polls, just talking to folks about how they view the process of voting as part of their engagement with the civic process. And then we define the problem. As I said, we're probably always given the wrong problem to work on first. Typically, people present solutions as if they were problems. I'm a wheelbarrow company and I need to design an innovative wheelbarrow. Well, that's actually the solution already, the wheelbarrow. And that's not where you're going to find interesting new ideas. So the big issue in design thinking is this notion of redefining the problem that you're given and defining it around what I call the nuanced data that you've come up with by having empathy for the users. We do a lot of invention in the next phase, ideation, brainstorming, biomimicry, morphological analysis, mind mapping. We have dozens and dozens of techniques for expanding the problem space. This is the flare part of the focus and flare process. And we believe that if you choose from lots and lots of good ideas, you're going to choose better. And then I'm going to spend a bunch of time talking about the prototyping and test phase, because that's where this notion of critique comes in. You'll notice in the whole process there's no word here that says critique. I think the critical thing to understand, or the thing that we just take for granted, is that this is a process that requires the kind of critical feedback that you can get from professionals and you can also get from users in order to be effective. So I would kind of maybe surround this whole diagram with a bubble that says critique. The next thing, of course, is that we have a process, but as the ex-president of Ford, Alan Mullehy, used to say, culture eats process for lunch. You can have any process you want, but if you don't have the mindsets of a creative culture, if you don't think like creative people, the process isn't going to get you very far. So we also emphasize, when we're teaching design thinking, learning the mindsets of a creative person, learning the mindsets of a designer. We start with this notion of curiosity. We accept that we don't know or really understand the problem as given, and so we go into the world with an open mind and a curious point of view. We often tell the students to go in to the field and do their ethnographic research with what we call beginner's mind, which is a sort of Zen concept of non-attached observation. We believe in radical collaboration because you don't get anything done if you're just working with people of a like mind, or you don't get innovative things done working with people of a like mind. And radical collaboration isn't 5 people from 5 different engineering teams. It's really, truly people from all aspects and all stakeholders in the problem. Typically, there's users in the radical collaboration team, in addition to the experts in design or interaction or engineering or psychology. But it would be quite common nowadays on a design thinking team to have a few designers, a psychologist, an anthropologist or professional ethnographer, and probably several other disciplines, maybe a finance person, a salesperson, and somebody who's maybe deeply involved in the manufacturing or delivery or implementation process that would be involved in whatever the product or service is. That's the kind of team that's going to come up with really unusual and interesting ideas for solving the problem in new ways. We believe the whole idea is really in reframing problems. That's where the new stuff comes from. I often tell if I've got an executive class and there's 50 people in the room, and I go, look, if I broke you into 10 teams of 5, and you're all really smart folks, and I gave you pretty much the same framing for the problem and the same data, within plus or minus 1 sigma, you would come up with very clever and interesting solutions, and they would all be roughly the same. But if I gave somebody different data, or I gave them an unfair advantage and allowed them to change the problem, who do you think would come up with the best ideas? And it's always the team that has more data, the data that they get from talking to users, and who's willing to look at the problem a different way. So we really think that the power of design thinking comes from this notion of problem finding as much or more than it comes from the idea of problem solving. So then bias to action, we tend to do stuff. If you come to one of our workshops, it's not a lecture-based sort of learning. We do everything here with the pedagogy called problem-based learning. You work on problems, you solve them, then you get harder problems, you solve them, and you keep laddering up the sophistication of your ability to create solutions. And then finally, mindful of process, which is sort of a meta thing. I'm going to talk about this because when you get into this notion of design and critique, the cycle of building your way into the future with the solutions that might be the things that delight your customers, this design critique process, it gets very messy. I've shown the design process as this linear thing, and it's typically anything but. There's a couple guys over at Berkeley back in the 70s who defined a thing they called a wicked problem. They said certain problems, certain, engineering problems or other problems are solvable because you can get enough data on the solution. And once you've resolved whatever the problem is, you've worked the equation or you've completed the analysis, there is typically one optimum solution to the problem. And those are what they call tame problems and what they call wicked problems. Not wicked in the sense that they're evil or immoral or anything like that. Just really, really hard problems have a very different set of characteristics. And these are the kinds of problems where we find design thinking working the best. They have a long morphology of what a wicked problem is, but I pulled out some of the things that I thought were the most interesting, or the ones that I run up against over and over again when we have design teams, either in our classes or professionally, working on really difficult open-ended things that we would describe as wicked. So one of the characteristics is that solutions to wicked problems are not right or wrong. There is no single solution that is best, and there's no single solution that is worst. I often, even in my beginning design classes, give students an assignment. You have a limited amount of materials, and you have to build some sort of a thing that does almost a nearly impossible task, and you can only use rubber bands and and cardboard and paper and glue. And they're like, well, what's the right answer? I mean, what's a right answer to this problem? And I go, well, I actually don't know the answer to this problem. That really frightens them. I said, I know how to work to the answer to this problem, but I've actually never solved it. And I can tell you that there are probably 1,000 pretty good answers to this problem, some more creative, some more inventive, some more delightful than others. But there's probably 1,000. That's the good news. The bad news is there's a couple of million really bad answers to this problem. And So you're really off into this sort of needle in the haystack search. And I can't tell you what makes one solution better or worse until you show me the solution. Which gets to the third point. A problem is not well understood until after you formulate a solution. What we find with the kinds of problems we're working on, civic engagement is one case. My students are currently working on. I have other students looking at 3D printing, additive printing, but using it in a much more inventive way to print clothing. I have other students looking at new ways of interacting and interfacing with computers using gesture and eye motion. We really don't know if the answers to those problems are going to be effective until after we've answered them, or at least what we call prototype them. So the formulation of a solution, this prototyping the possible future to find that 1,000 out of a million possible good answers is part of the problem. And this becomes pretty interesting when you say, gee, if you were in a consulting relationship and someone says, can you solve this problem? And you say, I don't know. I won't know until after I've solved it whether the solution I've got is anywhere near the thing that people want. And that feels to be so uncertain that it's often difficult, for people to accept this methodology of working. And then another thing is that every wicked problem can be considered a symptom of another problem. These things are nested like Russian dolls, and as soon as you solve something, the problem tends to get worse. Another way of looking at it is when we work with these human-centered, open-ended human-centered problems. How do you improve civic engagement? How do you, make more engaging interactions with computers, things like that? We say we start with people, but the problem with people, of course, is that they can't tell you what they want. They don't actually know the solution. They know they have a problem. They typically frame their problem in the sense of what they think is possible. They don't understand what technology might be able to do to solve the problem. They don't understand what possible kind of creative or inventive solutions are available. So when you ask them what they want, they tell you about something they already have. I used to be a toy designer a long time ago. I was working at Kenner Toys, which is now a part of Hasbro, and working on things like the Star Wars toys and other stuff. But Kenner was the company that made Play-Doh and the Easy Bake Oven, for those of you who remember these like classic toys, and Spirograph. And we used to, if you want to do testing, with a new product, you take it out and you put it in a room and you watch kids play with it. Children are probably the ultimate user who can't tell you what they want, right? They either play or they don't, and they don't have any articulation around their needs. If you say, why do you need to play? They don't know what you're talking about. So you got this problem where you need data, but the users can't give it to you. They can't tell you what they want. They frame their solutions around what they think is possible. Once you show them a solution, they change their mind and say they don't want that. And the interesting one is that everybody says they want innovation and they want something new and they want something different. They actually are frightened by things that change the paradigm for them. And so many innovations fail to connect in the marketplace with a large group of users because although the users claims to want something new and different, the new and different is actually pretty frightening. So, right there you could just stop. You could say, look, this is an unsolvable problem. People don't know what they want. They can't tell you what they want. Even if you make something for them, they change their minds. Every problem is a nested problem, and as soon as you solve it, another problem appears. And why would you want to be a designer? This is crazy stuff. Well, I said we've got this process, and we go through it. But the way it really looks when you actually experience it, it's something like this. Sometimes you go emphasize, define, ideate, prototype, test, and then you to go back and build another prototype test, and sometimes that doesn't work, so you have to go back and come up with some new ideas to do, and then sometimes that doesn't work, so you go back to trying to understand whether you've defined the problem correctly, and it gets to be quite chaotic in the middle of a project like this. It often feels more like this, where you really don't know where you're going. And you keep going back to users with new prototypes and asking new questions, and they keep changing their mind, and it gets to be quite confusing. So here's where this sort of central notion, I think that's embedded, the sort of the hidden optimism that's embedded inside design thinking, is this notion that you can solve this problem. First of all, we go back to the mindsets and we say, look, it's a process. It's a process of unfolding and revealing the solution that is in the future. It doesn't exist yet. It's in the future. So you have to accept that you can't know up front where you're going. You can only know what's next. What do we want to try next? And you get the team focused on, are we gathering new data? Are we asking new questions? Are we building new prototypes? What are we doing? And once you understand how to manage that process, things get a little bit less messy. And remember, you're always going to go back to the point of view that you don't know what you don't know. I think this is the most frightening for folks who come more from an engineering or science discipline, where they want to form a hypothesis, and then they want to test the hypothesis somehow, get a data set that they can match against the hypothesis. That's in fact a fantastic way to advance science. Without the scientific method, we wouldn't have any of the technology we're using today to sort of remotely talk to each other. But the problem is that requires that the hypothesis is testable. It requires that data is available or can be generated through some kind of a process, and that the data can be matched back to the hypothesis. And design thinking, when I explained it to a scientist once, I said, well, we don't do a hypothesis. We go out and get some stuff, some data from the field, and then we come up with this thing we call a point of view, and then we go test that with a bunch of prototypes, and then we find that it's wrong, so we change our point of view. And he says, well, you can't change your hypothesis to match your data. That's cheating. And I said, well, no, that's design. It's not science. It's the method we use to sort of unfold or discover the future. So we go back to this notion of need finding, and if you've been to any of the other webinars or just been to a design thinking boot camp or anything, you may have seen this picture of the iceberg where we talk about need finding. It's true that users can't tell you what they want. So that's not a good question to ask them. We don't ask those kinds of questions. But we do try to get past the explicit stuff that everyone can observe, the top of the iceberg, to this, and also past the stuff that's just a little bit below the surface, where they're talking about what the problem really is for them and how it impacts them, to get to where the core insights will come from, is where the meanings and values layer of that iceberg, the problem iceberg. And in the meanings and values, you discover them because people tell you stories. A classic example would be when we all had our old flip phones, if you'll remember that, for those of you who are not 20 on the call. You used to have a menu-driven interface, and you had your hundreds of whatever contacts in the little contact menu, and I'd be talking to Corinne on the phone, and she'd say, "Gee, what's Ryan's phone number?" And I'd go, "Well, I know it's in here somewhere, but I'm probably going to hang up if I try to find it. So if I do, I'll call you back." And then you'd start scrolling through menus and trying to find your contact list and your phone number, and then you'd hang up. So everyone can tell you the story of that experience, and then what they'll tell you is how stupid they felt, how the phone made them feel dumb or inadequate, how embarrassed they were that it hung up in the middle of this important phone call. So they weren't talking about the technology, they weren't talking about interactions, but they were talking about a very, very deeply meaningful experience. And in that process, you could decode, oh, okay, if I could find a way for people to easily discover the data that's in their phone, let's say maybe it was how about a visual interaction model, or a non-hierarchical menu-driven model, or something that isn't modal. We know all those things are easier for people to remember, that people can't remember more than 2 or 3 steps in any interaction. So if I make it a flat interaction, well, but that would mean that would need a screen, I would need graphics, I would need touch, ... So, from that one observation, can you invent an iPhone? No, but you can understand the paradigm that you're trying to shift and flip it. And when you take a person whose technology is making them feel stupid, and you give them technology that makes them feel powerful, smart, and effective, you've won a customer for life. So we go back to need finding again and again and again, and we do it through the critical process of prototyping and critiquing to try to understand, whether or not we're done yet. So this gets us to the design thing, that's prototype and test cycle. Prototype and test. What is a prototype? In our model, a prototype is not the thing you build to show everybody what you're going to do. That's something else. There's parts of the process down in implementation where you want to attract people to your idea, and your idea is finished, and you're building beautiful models of things that to show people how it will look when it's finally in existence. We use prototyping a very different way. Just think of it as very simple. Prototyping is about asking a question, typically one question. I'm making an observation that these kinds of phone interactions make you feel stupid. I'm going to try to build an interaction that makes you feel smart. It's always less than the whole product. It's always one simple question, and it's always a point of view that is testable. The idea of flipping from making you feel stupid to making you feel smart is a testable idea. We can build something. We can certainly build something that will frustrate you, and we can build something that you will be able to solve easily, and we can watch your reaction. And in observing those reactions and then critiquing the prototype itself, we get to a cycle that unlocks the value in this process. And the way we do the critique, the way we do the testing is this methodology, that was in the title of the webinar called I Like, I Wish. There's a lot of ways to do critique, but if you really think about what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make things that will provoke users to react or act a certain way, and we're observing how they act, and it's kind of fuzzy. We need to videotape them and have lots of people look at the tapes and things and try to understand what we're doing. But in the process of unlocking or decoding their interactions, we're doing this very critical framing of whether or not the prototype has successfully answered the question. So, people think design is all about brainstorming and having lots of ideas and walls full of Post-its. That's the flare part. That's the generative part. That's the divergent part. But far more time is typically spent in the convergent or critical part. I was 7 years at Apple, and although the rumor is Apple does no research, they just know what to do and they know how to tell you what you want. It's not true at all. We did tons and tons and tons of user research. We tested and tested and tested. To make things as simple and as easy to use as Apple products, you have to test relentlessly. And the critical thinking, the making critical decisions and deciding whether to make something blue or white or move it over a half a pixel or leave it where it was is probably what we spent most of our time doing. Because the divergent part, the coming up with lots of ideas, as much fun as it is actually goes pretty quickly. When you get good at it, you can have lots of ideas quickly. But choosing, down selecting to the ones that are truly the most effective is what this whole process is about. So this prototype test, prototype critique, prototype I Like, I Wish cycle is the core. It's like the engine that drives the whole innovation process forward. And we call it I Like, I Wish for a particular reason. I don't know if any of the folks who are listening to the webinar have let's say, an art or an architecture or a graphic design background. But if you went to school for graphic design or for architecture or something, you were quite used to critiques. The process goes all the way back, to the Renaissance and the guilds, where you would. The young apprentices would paint a painting or make a sculpture, and then the master would come in and critique it and tell them what they had done wrong. It's the classic process for learning these sort of open-ended creative activities like graphic design or architecture or art or design. You build, you get a prompt design a coffee cup. You make one, you bring it into the instructor who is a master in the field, or you're asked to design a poster, or you're asked to design a building of a certain type. And the process, the critiques in an architecture program can go 3-4 hours, very, very detailed and often quite critical, quite aggressively critical language is used to try to get the student to understand what has been left out, what is missing, where the details are not correct. It's an essential part of any art curriculum to do this critique. Now, what we noticed, because we come from this tradition as well, is that when you critique, when it's an open-ended critical conversation, it can, unless handled extremely well by people who are masterful at the language, it can turn into what feels very much like an attack. And particularly young designers or people just on a design team who have not signed up for the, for the full-blown, architecture critique methodology of, 4 hours of being told what you did wrong. People who are on a design team, in a multidisciplinary design team, cannot absorb the information from a critique that is done in an unstructured way. What happens is, and this is true if you've ever been given a performance review, a negative performance review, or you've ever had, even when you were in school, you had a negative experience with a professor who thought your performance on a test or something wasn't up to snuff. As soon as the person begins to criticize you, or to criticize your performance on the test or your delivery of the model, the architectural model, you immediately, although the critique is about the thing you did, you immediately hear the critique as it being about you. It's almost impossible to separate the thing you did or the action you took from who you are. And so in an open-ended critique format, what happens is you hear the criticism of this new idea you have for the design of something that your team is working on as an attack on yourself. Once you believe that you're being attacked that way, even if it's a very light, sort of a negative, if we put your brain in a brain scanner, we would see your amygdala light up. The amygdala is one of the centers of the brain that controls your fear response. When you're being attacked, it is a logical thing for your brain to prepare your body for either fight, flight, or freeze. So the fight, flight, or freeze response is turned on. Adrenaline starts flowing in your body. Other stress chemicals come up, and your hearing sensitivity drops, and blood flows into the outer organs and into your musculoskeletal system so that you can run. Now, all of those responses might have been, appropriate biological responses when we were, apes in a jungle, or, in tribal cultures where, attack was a physical thing. Most of us are knowledge workers, and, either running away or grabbing a spear and stabbing the person who's doing the critique is probably an inappropriate reaction. Nevertheless, once you put someone into that fight, flight, or fear reaction, they no longer can absorb the lessons or messages that are in the critique. So we have evolved, in talking with neuroscientists and also talking with people who are very adept at this, we evolved a process in the D School almost from the very beginning, because we knew we would have to deliver a critique that was incisive, that was direct, that was actionable, but we'd have to deliver it in a way that was also efficient and effective, that people could actually hear it. In talking with some neuroscientists, we developed this method we call I like, I wish. And it's really quite simple. You start with a positive, because if you start with a negative, you evoke the fight, flight, or freeze response, and the sensitivity to listening drops, and the ability to parse the information drops significantly, so people don't hear what you're saying. So we start with I like. I like begins with some kind of a positive affirmation. Even in work that is really incomplete, in a design team, there is some element of something that has gone right. By highlighting that element first and talking to the positives about the group or the group interaction or some element of the design, early design solution or prototype, you set the group up and you set the individual who's being critiqued up for an active, engaged listening. And then by posing the criticisms as an I wish, you're actually sort of almost, we believe what happens is you reframe the criticism as a gift. Let's say we're back to the proverbial coffee cup, and I'd ask someone to design a coffee cup, and they designed something, but it was asymmetrical, and when you tried to drink out of it, it spilled all over your shirt. You know, you could say, look, I like the form of the cup. I like the materials that you chose. I like the colors. They're great. I wish we didn't have this problem where when I use it, you know, it spills. I wish we could look at ways of reframing, you know, this opening, or the way the asymmetrical quality of the thing makes it unusual and interesting, but I wish it didn't have the issue of spilling or whatever. So the wish is sort of the gift. You know, and oftentimes when we say I wish, we actually propose the possible alternative solution. So it seems like I'm making maybe a big deal out of a little deal, but actually it's critical. If you don't have the prototype test process, design thinking doesn't work, because we're trying to figure out how to invent things that don't exist. And it's hard enough that the users are giving us incomplete information, sometimes false information. They say they want something, and then when you give it to them, they don't want it. So we need to find a way to rapidly evolve what's possible, what's next. What do I know about the user that I can prototype? I prototype something. Okay, we get a bunch of critical feedback. We do an I like, I wish. We reframe the problem. We do another prototype. We do it again. We're constantly using the prototype test process to ask questions. But it only works if we can give each other and the users very critical feedback in order for this to work. So, you know, you may not be on a design team right now where you can try this methodology, but I would really suggest you try it. It works fantastically in you know, just colleague to colleague when you're just trying to get a more efficient interaction going. And instead of saying, gee, you know, Ryan, I hate it when you micromanage me like that because I don't think I do my best work, that's just going to sound like a critique. And I can say, I really, you know, but Ryan, I really like the fact that you really get into the details of what I'm doing. I feel good that, you know, you really see all the work that I'm doing. I wish we could have a different way of interacting around what my objectives are. It's like, it's so much easier to have that conversation than the negative conversation. And you can try it with friends, you can try it with partners, and it's a really good thing to do with children, with your children, kids, or kids that, you know, maybe if you're in a Girl Scout troop or Boy Scout troop, you're interacting with lots of children, certainly with your own children. We have a famous psychologist here, Carol Dweck, who wrote a book on mindsets, and was promoting the notion of a growth mindset over a fixed mindset. And the notion is that with children, if the children believe that their accomplishments and capabilities are fixed, like if I say, oh, you're so smart, then that's why you do so well, then they think, well, they're smart. They had nothing to do with that. That's just a fixed thing, and they're doing well because they're smart. And then when they hit a roadblock and they can't do something, they have no framework to figure out how to fix that, because obviously they're not smart enough to do that thing. Whereas she says, if you say, you know, you did so well because you worked so hard, and you know, if you ever run into a problem that you can't solve, you can always work harder. That's a growth mindset, and you can get to that very quickly by giving children the feedback in the I like, I wish, you know, in the I like, I wish framework. So that the trick is you always start with a positive observation, and you make it specific. It's not just, oh, you know, you're so nice. That's not an observation that sticks. It has to be specific, and it needs to typically be emotional. So you're affirming something positive that's specific and emotional about the person or the situation. And you move to the critical observation. You make it non-personal as much as possible. You make it as specific as possible, and you make it actionable. I wish you would do these things for these reasons. And you precede that comment with an I wish. If you do those two things, you tend to find that critical feedback loop in any situation works best, and it's critical in the design situation if we're ever going to get to the end. So how do you know you're done in a design problem? Well, sometimes we joke and say, well, when you're out of time, you're done, essentially. I mean, it's certainly in school, when the deadline comes and you need to do the critique, it's time. But it's also true in business that, things have budgets, things have schedules, things have time, and when you're out of time, you want to have the optimum solution. So here's the deal. In the best of all possible worlds, you are trying to invent a future world where your product or service or idea is embedded in that world. Embedded means it's going to show up in the user story. When we do the need finding in the future, the user's going to say, I use this thing because it makes me feel smart, or whatever they're going to say. But we're looking to have the product show up in their story in the way in which the users can't imagine how they could possibly have lived without this thing that you made. The best, the highest form of this kind of design thinking is inventing something that nobody even knew they wanted. But when they see it, they have to have it because they recognize that it will solve a problem that was latent in their world. The iPhone is often used as an example because it was such a revolutionary redesign of the whole phone experience when it first came out. Nobody knew they wanted it until they saw it and then saw how other people were using it. When I was at Apple, we never talked so much about specific design things and everything else. We were trying to make objects that delighted people, that made them feel smart and made them feel powerful. Because back in the early 70s when Apple was first invented, the company was first formed by Steve and Steve, it was all about putting the power of computing in the hands of the common person. Because in those days, computers were used by, high priests in air-conditioned rooms. And Apple still has that DNA, that the goal is to give you a product that makes you feel smart, that's easy to use, that you just know how to use, that you don't have to learn, and that somehow or other you come away delighted by the experience. So you'll know you're done when you've invented something that the users, when you show them that last prototype, they won't give it back because it's so good and they're so delighted that they can't imagine their future without the product or service that you've designed. Okay. I'm going to open up for some questions. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan in a second here, open up some questions, but I just want to, kind of reiterate the design thinking is really this process on teams, in companies, in individuals. It's about unlocking the creative potential that's inside all of us. And David talks about it in terms of this notion of creative confidence. He and his brother Tom have got a great book if you're looking to read more about this. And they talk about it like I wish, and they talk about the quality of how great critique makes great design and creates great confidence. This isn't about everybody's above, average and everybody's special. If you don't, the number one review I get from my students is we want the critiques to be even more incisive, even more direct, because that's how we get better. So Creative Confidence, Unleashing the Creative Potential in All of Us is a book that came out just about 6 months ago. Fantastic introduction to the overall ideas of design thinking, and particularly how to improve and instill your own creativity or the creativity of people you work with, and especially if you're parents of your children. Yeah, there's a few questions I can answer real quickly here that are just sort of a little bit of housekeeping. People, in the slide with David Kelly, there was a link to his TED Talk. The slides will be available after the webinar for that link, but if you just go to the TED site and search David Kelly Creative Confidence, that I believe is the only talk up there under that, and you'll be able to find him easily. The TED Talks are always great because they're very condensed, very concise sort of stories, and this talk was just prior to the publishing of the book. What other books you recommend for design thinking teams and process? Tim Brown wrote a great book called Change by Design, which is Tim Brown is the CEO of IDEO. Another guy, Roger Martin, wrote a book. He's the dean of the Rotman School of Management in the University of Toronto. Roger Martin wrote a book called The Design of Business, which frames the same sort of ideas in sort of a business framework. In addition, David and his brother Tom have a couple of HBR, Harvard Business Review articles that are probably worth reading if you don't want to digest the whole book. A couple other questions that I thought were pretty interesting. There's a question that said, do you use or subscribe to complexity theory as part of design thinking, or do you see any relationship? I have to admit that I went to Wikipedia to find out what complexity theory is, you know, as I understand it, you know, complexity theory is in its most abstract. It's looking at complex systems that are mathematically difficult to model, that are defined as mathematically difficult to model. These are nonlinear, chaotic systems, or systems that cannot be easily predicted. Obviously, the kinds of things I'm talking about are very complex systems because they're complex. They're complex because humans are involved and because the humans all have different reactions to things. So I don't, you know, there's nothing that we do specifically that would be related to complexity theory, although we are clearly trying to work inside of and be effective in complex systems. That said, one of our new professors, Aaron McDonald, who we just stole from the Iowa University, is modeling the complex interactions between people, products, and markets. So she's doing what's called a conjoint analysis of complex systems to understand how people make decisions in marketplaces where certain characteristics of the product can be, you know, either promoted or not. And particularly, she's looking at how we can get people to value sustainability. People right now, you buy a product because you use a service because it works for you in the moment. You don't think about its impact on the environment. You don't think about whether it's a sustainable product or not. And so she's using quantitative methods to model complex systems around the notion of promoting sustainability. So I don't know that she would describe herself as a complexity theorist, but she is certainly using the tools of modeling, mathematical modeling, to understand some of these complex relationships between users, their behaviors, and the markets they participate in. There's another question that said, what happens when the user is one of your clients and there's no opportunity for test, engage. You know, for 14 years, I ran a consulting company in the Valley here, and we did lots and lots of, you know, client-driven product development, product design, engineering, and innovation. Filed a couple hundred patents for our clients. I'm a little bit cynical, I guess, about the consultant-client relationship. Like, you know, we have to please the client, or we can't talk to the client because, you know, we don't want to admit to the client that we don't actually know what we're doing yet. So I'm not exactly sure what situation you're describing in the question, but I think one of my answers would be redefine the relationship you have with your client. Instead of you're the expert selling them your solution, redefine it as a co-creation environment where you're both doing the need finding and you're both discovering, you know, where the nuanced data is around the complex system that you're trying to solve. So I would reframe the problem, because that's one of the things we do, that the client is now co-creating the solution. And then if that's not possible, the other thing we do, in some cases, for instance, when we're looking at severe situations in medical environments, because of HIPAA regulations and privacy laws and lots of really good reasons, you can't just walk into a hospital and start talking to patients and finding out what's going on. And we were given the assignment to redesign the emergency room experience at the Stanford hospital. And so the ability to actually co-create with people in the emergency room is fairly limited for a lot of good reasons. You look for analogous situations. We discovered that the situation in an emergency room is pretty equivalent to the situation in a NASCAR pit crew. And so we went to NASCAR, and so the designers who were working on this problem got into the pits at a race and watched how people assess, the cars pull in, they assess the issues with the car, they do a quick triage on what's possible to fix. They have redundant systems for everything. If they're changing wheels, they've got 3 wheels, not just one. They've got 3 air guns, not just one. Everything is put on trays. Everything is organized around the fastest possible response time. and you watch, the best pit crews can, completely service a car in 16 seconds and it's back on the track, and you're like, how the hell did they do that? So we use the analogous situation of that to the hospital situation of a patient comes in, it has to be triaged quickly, you have to be able to perform whatever's an emergency rapidly, but at the same time that patient is going through the process needs to know exactly where they are in each part of the process. So you can often find analogous situations that will allow you to do the kind of need finding or the kind of inventive research that will that can allow you to have these ideas show up in a situation where it wasn't possible to do the primary research with the actual client. How do you, this is my favorite one and probably the last one, we're out of time. How do you handle culture change to get people to take this approach? How do you nudge people when they fall back into their traditional critique modes? Culture change is a really big topic. It's one of the things we work a lot on in the master class because it's not fun to teach the class and people just go back to their organizations and nothing changes. It's not fun for us anyway. And culture change is hard. What we've discovered is that you need two things. You need absolute support from the top, whatever the top, whoever decides who has power, who has money, who has a staff, who has people in the organization, typically the senior management, have to buy into this as a change. Because if they don't, what happens is even if the teams change, the behaviors aren't rewarded, and therefore people are smart. They stop doing things if they don't get rewards. But you also have to have, small core teams that are kind of changing these behaviors, from the inside out. So it's a kind of, small cell of people working differently and supporting each other who, when they run into inevitably issues with the larger organization, they have the support from top management. You need both. You can't. One is insufficient, and if you have both, we find that the success of the small team gets replicated over and over and over again in other small teams. We don't prescribe to it's a giant, culture change, and then you do 10 weeks of training and the whole organization changes at once. That's not really the way people work. They have to see rewards for their behavior. They have to behave differently. Then they have to see that their different behaviors get rewarded, and then others will copy them. So you need the inside out and the top down is our quickie answer to the how do you change culture. In just changing culture in a meeting so that I wish is enforced can simply be modeled by the leader of the meeting. The more you want people to change behavior, model the behavior you want them to change.
Bill, thank you so much for this opportunity and the insight. I will look forward to seeing you on December 10th with the rest of our participants in the Innovation Master Series. And with that, we thank you for attending, and this ends today's webinar.